Though marijuana is now a household name, there was a time when it was an obscure drug, used only by the fringes of society. That, some argue, is the reason why it was criminalized.
That none of the drugs currently illegal became illegal before they were most closely associated with what were commonly regarded as deviant groups.
Except for a handful of states in the Southwest, marijuana is still legal in the United States. But that will change soon after Harry J. Anslinger, the nation's top drug enforcement agent, takes office at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The Bureau's efforts have been aimed at fighting heroin and cocaine. But with Anslinger's arrival in 1930, marijuana is the new drug problem born out of the trouble in the Southwest with Mexican migrant workers.
They were worried about all these Mexicans down on the Texas border who were, it was the depths of the Depression. And these Mexicans had been a very useful labor force in the 20s when we needed them, but now as the Depression, you got all these gringos in the breadline, you sure as hell don't need all these Mexicans. So how could we stigmatize them and get rid of this cheap labor force and get them out of here?
In 1931, Mexican repatriation becomes law. Mexicans who don't go quietly are subject to varying forms and degrees of harassment. Many are charged with vagrancy. Others are arrested for violation of new state marijuana laws that are often an excuse to drive Mexicans out of the country.
He had tried to get the states to adopt a uniform narcotic law, which would include cannabis. That had some success, but not complete. There was continued pressure on the government in Washington to do something about these Mexican immigrants who smoked marijuana, but by and large, there was nothing they could do about it. There was no real big action. They didn't have the funding, they didn't have the people. And I remember he said to me once, I was driving around the upper Potomac, and I was crossing the bridge, and I just parked on the bridge, and I got out and I looked, and there was marijuana plants as far as you could see. And he said, I said to myself, and they want me to wipe this out.
Anslinger can do nothing to stop the push from states of the Southwest for a federal law against marijuana. The issue is less about the dangers of the drugs and more about politics. Marijuana is entangled in immigration problems.
I remember when I interviewed Harry Anslinger about it, he said we weren't having any trouble with it. You could get it in Harlem, he said, and it was not a problem. But the pressure came from the Southwest and the West, where the Mexican immigrants were seen as a unnecessary and dangerous surplus population. And so there was a tremendous campaign to try to push the Mexican immigrants back into Mexico. And marijuana got mixed up in that, because there was no question that they grew marijuana and smoked marijuana.
Texas, California, Arizona, and Colorado insist it's the federal government's responsibility to do something. To Anslinger, there is nothing glamorous about fighting drugs. But soon he sees that it is one of the most important issues of his time, endorsed by some of the country's most powerful men, like publisher William Randolph Hearst.
The Sun newspaper. New York, June 19, 1904, 3rd section, page 10. Dangerous Mexican weed to smoke. From the Mexican Herald, Manuel Guerrero and Florencio Pino had the marijuana habit, and for the last few weeks have been smoking big cigarettes in which tobacco was mixed with the dangerous weed. Tuesday afternoon the two men smoked cigarettes composed of tobacco and smaller, proportioned in marijuana, and after a few minutes ran amok. They went out into the streets shouting, vociferating and attacking everybody. First they marched hand in hand, declaring that they were the bravest men on earth and would kill anybody who dared to say a word to the contrary, but at last Pino declared that he was still braver than his friend, and a fight followed, the two receiving dangerous wounds. They were captured and sent to the hospital, where they had to be put into straitjackets. It is feared that the two men, if they recover from their wounds, will lose their minds permanently, as is often the case with marijuana smokers.
Anslinger went to visit Hearst at San Simeon Castle, I guess it was one time, And Hearst told him that he personally wrote all of the anti-drug editorials in the Hearst newspapers. And he was just astounded that anyone would, who's really important, would care about it.
Hearst coins the phrase marijuana menace and prints lurid tales about the drug's capacity to cause rape, murder, and mayhem. Just as reports of cocaine-crazed Negroes a decade ago had stirred lawmakers to ban cocaine, headlines and stories of the marijuana menace were affecting cannabis the same way.
And it gets back to the scapegoat. So you can scapegoat different racial groups, you can scapegoat the lower classes, you can use the drug to do the scapegoating for you. You can attack them because they're using the drug.
According to the San Antonio Gazette, quote, "The men who smoke this herb become excited to such an extent that they go through periods of near frenzy and worse. It is always aggressive as the crimes which have been committed in garrisons, armories, barracks, and the humble suburbs of Mexico." The southwestern states prevail upon Anslinger to do something. Hesitant as he may have been, the pressure is on for Anslinger to use the power of the federal government to control marijuana. Ever the bureaucrat, Anslinger changes his position and becomes a leading warrior against marijuana.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
While a propaganda war against marijuana is underway, Anslinger begins working to draft a law.
A law was passed called the National Firearms Act, which said that you could not give, borrow, or transfer a machine gun to anyone without a machine gun transfer stamp. And it turns out the government would not make any machine gun transfer stamps.
The Supreme Court ruled the National Firearms Act was legal, and its use of stamps, even though purposely not available, was legitimate. Anslinger now has a model for a national ban against marijuana. Anslinger's idea to make marijuana illegal is simple. Anyone involved in its use, distribution, sale, or transfer will be required to get from the government a marijuana tax stamp. On April 27, 1937, hearings begin before Congress on the first federal law to control marijuana. Anslinger hopes to convince Congress that marijuana is dangerous and that they will enact a law like the one that banned machine guns. Anslinger tells Congress the drug makes the user insane or worse. Anslinger also tells Congress marijuana is the stepping stone or gateway to heroin and cocaine. He adds that it is the assassin of youth. Anslinger tells Congress that school children are using marijuana. That assertion results in the only testimony against the law. Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association testifies that for all the complaints about marijuana's danger to school children, there was no evidence to back it up. Congress disregards his testimony.
They just attacked him viciously. They said, how can you come down here trying to interrupt us when we're trying to do something good for the American people and so forth? Well, it turns out their argument with him had nothing to do with marijuana. They just chopped him into pieces and verbally excoriated him in front of this congressional hearing and then lied about what he said.
After 5 days of hearings, the marijuana tax law goes to Congress for a vote. It's passed within weeks by roll call vote. President Roosevelt signs the bill on August 2nd. It takes effect October 1st. On Capitol Hill, Southwest gets the federal law they wanted. The law requires that anyone wishing to buy, sell, distribute, or transfer marijuana must pay a tax and have a stamp. The penalty for failure to do so is 5 years in jail, a $2,000 fine, or both. But like the machine gun law, the government doesn't make the marijuana stamps available.
By emphasizing the Spanish word marijuana instead of cannabis, he created a strong association between the drug and the newly arrived Mexican immigrants who helped popularize it in the States. The discrimination they encouraged was evident in real numbers. In the first full year after the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, Black people were about 3 times more likely to be arrested for violating narcotic drug laws than whites, and Mexicans were nearly 9 times more likely to be arrested for the same charge.